Hi everyone, and welcome to the story of Johnson & Johnson and the Tylenol murders. The Johnson & Johnson family of company includes McNeil's, which is the company that manufactures Tylenol. Tylenol was the most successful over-the-counter product in the US. It had over 100 million users. It was responsible for 19% of Johnson & Johnson's corporate profits for the first 3 quarters of 1982. And 13% of Johnson & Johnson's year-to-year sales growth. As well as that, was responsible for 33% of the company's year-to-year profit growth. So Tylenol was a pretty significant product for Johnson & Johnson. It was the absolute leader in the painkiller field. It had a staggering 37% market share, and it outsold the next 4 leading painkillers combined. If Tylenol had been a separate corporate entity, it would have been in the top half of the Fortune 500, so you can see how significant it was. However, at 10 a.m. on Thursday, the 30th of September 1982, Jim Ritter, who was a consumer reporter for the Chicago Sun-Times, called Johnson & Johnson and asked James Murray, who was a J&J PR deputy, for some statistics on Tylenol. James Murray called McNeil, who was a wholly owned manufacturer of Tylenol, and was asked by Elsie Beamer at McNeil when he rang for the information, "Is this about the terrible thing that happened in Chicago?" James said no, but noticed that Elsie sounded out of breath. "What happened in Chicago?" Elsie said, "We heard some people have been poisoned with Tylenol capsules. I'm going down to a meeting right now to find out more." James Murray started to get up from his desk. Then his secretary rushed in and told him that the Sun-Times reporter was on the phone again, and this time it was urgent. Jim Ritter told James Murray that he hadn't known why his city editor had asked him to call before, but he now did. The Cook County Medical Examiner's Office had reported that 3 people had been killed as a result of ingesting cyanide in Tylenol capsules. Jim was wanting to know if Johnson & Johnson had a comment. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the building, Arthur Quilty, who was a member of the executive, was finishing some last-minute arrangements for his trip to Europe the next week to discuss J&J's ambitious offshore expansion plans. He got a call from PR. When he received that call, Arthur asked, "Are you sure this isn't a hoax?" before being quickly convinced and springing into action. These are the Tylenol capsules that we're talking about. On the 5th floor of Johnson & Johnson's headquarters in New Brunswick, the Johnson & Johnson's chair James Burke was having a quiet meeting with President David Clare as Quilty burst into the room and told them about the cyanide deaths in Chicago. David Collins, the chairman of McNeil and Johnson & Johnson exec member, was on a phone conference to Mexico when he was summoned to the 5th floor. 15 minutes after David hung up on his call, James Burke was filling him in on the biggest problem of his career. He was to take charge of coordinating the company's response to the Tylenol crisis. James told him to take a lawyer, a public relations aide and a security person and fly immediately in the company helicopter over to McNeil, which was 60 miles away in Fort Washington, Pennsylvania, and he was to handle things from there. Meanwhile, James dispatched a company plane to fly a scientist, a PR assistant and a security agent directly to Chicago. Meanwhile, the switchboards were lighting up at both McNeil and Johnson & Johnson. At first the calls came from the newspapers, TV and radio station, but some were as far away as Honolulu and Ireland. However, as the story started to break, even more calls began to pour in from pharmacies, from doctors, from hospitals, from poison control centres, and from hundreds of panicked consumers asking for clarifications that Johnson & Johnson couldn't give, and many people making what turned out to be false reports of possible poisonings, which complicated the issue. David Collins recalled, "It looked like the plague. We had no idea where it would end, and the only information we had was that we didn't know what was going on." David's first move was to call an old roommate of his from university, a lawyer who handled some of Johnson & Johnson's business in Chicago, and ask him if he could go to the medical examiner's office, find out as much as he could, and call him back. As David says, he needed his own eyes and ears on the scene. However, seeing the impeccably landscaped McNeil's grounds appeared to David as his helicopter touched down, inside the natural order of the plant was in absolute turmoil. There were harried managers running back and forth between telephone banks, the president's office, bringing in new reports of fatalities and other supposed poisonings. Every bit of information was being scribbled with laundry markers on drawing paper that was held up by a big easel. As the reports accumulated, the sheets were being ripped off and pinned on the walls. Soon the president's office was papered with a confusing mass of information, with arrows drawn between them: victims, causes of death, lot numbers on the poisoned Tylenol bottles, where they'd been purchased, dates when they'd been manufactured, and the route that they must have taken through J&J's distribution system, all the way back to the 14 stainless steel machines in Fort Washington that make the capsules and spit them out at a rate of over 1,000 a minute. PR consultant Scott Weingart's uncle worked for several years at J&J as the chief industrial engineer. He was really passionate about his job. He was always looking for ways to improve efficiency. Scott asked his uncle to reflect on the great or not so great moments of leadership that he'd experienced over his time at J&J. The most powerful story that his uncle told Scott involved the Tylenol crisis. Even though when Scott's uncle told him it had happened over 3 decades ago, Scott's uncle's memories of the experience were really vivid, and his emotions about it still ran very deeply. He said, "When I first heard that this awful thing was happening, I was shocked. It was unthinkable that someone could do such an evil thing." He recollected with really harsh words said through gritted teeth what kind of person could have laced Tylenol capsules with potassium cyanide, which led overall to 12 deaths. But the startling development was his reaction to J&J's senior leaders. "I couldn't believe how quickly they responded to the crisis. It was truly amazing," he said. Before he even knew what to think, he was required to attend a cross-functional meeting at which the strategic and tactical game plan of response to the crisis was announced. Johnson & Johnson chairman James Burke reacted to the situation by forming a 7-member strategy team. The team's strategy guidance from Burke was first, how do we protect people, and much later, how do we save the product. The company's first actions were to immediately alert consumers across the nation using the media, telling them not to consume any Tylenol product at all. The company entered a very close relationship to the press, much closer than it was accustomed to. Johnson & Johnson effectively opened its doors. They were getting some of their most accurate and up-to-date information about what was going on around the country from the reporters who were calling in for comment. Johnson & Johnson also needed the media to get as much information out to the public as quickly as possible to prevent a panic. A lecturer of mine told me in a management class many years ago that as Johnson & Johnson staff went home, they voluntarily called at shops near where they lived and cleared all the Tylenol off the shelves. If the stores were reluctant for them to take it without payment, Johnson & Johnson staff paid for the packages themselves, trusting that the company would reimburse them when they took it into work on Friday morning. On Friday the 1st of October 1982, 7 unsuspecting people had died a horrible death. News reports were stating that a malevolent person or persons, presumably unknown, had been replacing those Tylenol extra-strength capsules with cyanide-laced capsules, resealing the packages and depositing them on the shelves of at least half a dozen or so pharmacies and food stores in the Chicago area. Johnson & Johnson had clear statements being broadcast in the media by this time. They told consumers not to resume using any of their product until the extent of the tampering could be determined, and to also return all Tylenol to J&J and they would be reimbursed. Along with stopping production and advertising of Tylenol, Johnson & Johnson withdrew all Tylenol capsules from retailer shelves in Chicago and the surrounding area. However, after they found 2 more contaminated bottles, they ordered a national withdrawal of every capsule. By withdrawing all the Tylenol, even though there was little chance of discovering more cyanide-laced tablets, Johnson & Johnson showed they weren't willing to take a risk with public safety, even though it cost the company an estimated $100 million. The end result was that the public viewed Tylenol as the unfortunate victim of a malicious crime. In the first week of the crisis, Johnson & Johnson, aside from the advertising and media campaign, they had established an 800 number hotline for consumers to call and to respond to inquiries concerning Tylenol safety. They also established a toll-free line for news organisations to call and to get pre-taped daily messages and updated statements about the crisis. Before the crisis, Johnson & Johnson hadn't actively sought press coverage, but as they were in crisis, they recognised the benefits of open communications and used them. Several conferences were held at corporate headquarters. They set up a live television feed via satellite to the New York metro area. They allowed all press conferences to go national. Jim Burke got more positive media exposure by going on 60 Minutes and The Donahue Show and by giving the public his messages. After the crisis, Johnson & Johnson communicated their new triple safety seal packaging, a glued box, a plastic seal around the neck of the bottle and a foil seal over the bottle under the lid. They also stopped making capsules and started making tablets. They released all this at a press conference at McNeil's headquarters. Tylenol became the first product in the industry to use new tamper-resistant packaging just 6 months after the crisis had occurred.